So there's this double connection. But sorry for the distraction. Her paper is called Revisiting Thoreau. So please, Professor Bandyopadhyay.
Thank you. I should just add at the beginning that this was at the time of Rabindranath Tagore himself, and the university where I teach has Rabindranath Tagore as the founder. And on his invitation, there was this arrival from Italy. Okay, so yes, but to move on to my paper, I'll begin with a disclaimer. The disclaimer is about me being just a humble student of American literature. I cannot claim to be a scholar. But what I want to share today is my enthusiasm, renewed enthusiasm, so to say, for Walden, for Thoreau, for civil disobedience, especially in these very trying times. So I would actually point out just a few things about how I look at Walden in these times, in the sense of we have this image of America in our minds, that people are ambitious over there, people want to achieve a lot of success in their lives, and how in Walden, Thoreau was questioning in the mid-19th century, in 1854, he was questioning these basic ideas of the so-called American society, a cohesive kind of a society, according to most of the people by that time already, in a sense. I would begin by referring to how he differed from most of the average American, so to say, in terms of his aspirations. And by way of proof, I would begin by mentioning the image of the leaven used by Thoreau in Walden, where in the section on bread, he is trying to say that he borrowed this leaven from the local village, and he was baking his own bread. And in this context, he says it is as important, it is the soul of the bread, it is as important as the Vestal fire. And then he goes on to say, this was first brought over in the Mayflower, did the business for America, and its influence is still rising, swelling, spreading in connection, in cerulean billows over this land, unquote. Now, I was trying to talk about this image of America flourishing, growing, doing business, prospering, and how Thoreau gradually and very decisively gives up using leaven altogether personally. His bread henceforth was prepared without this leaven, and it worked fine for him. At the same time, he was talking about the absolute necessities of life and how he could be self-sufficient to a certain extent. And in this context, he said the farmers over here are giving away their so-called ill corns, not ill in the sense of sickness or something like that, but what they don't consider to be useful enough or significant enough, they're giving away to their cattle as cattle feed. Whereas he chose to grow rye and Indian corn on his own so that he wouldn't have to barter, borrow, trade, or enter into any such thing that would be a burden to his time, his independence. In this sense, I find that his aspirations are somewhat different from the other people, the farmers, the neighbors, the friends even, who told him about certain kinds of activities. And he chose just to work for a few days as a day laborer during the year. And that was it. He could survive fine on his own. If aspiration is one point based on which he questioned the American society or the neighbors, the other example or proof of his growing difference from the average American idea perhaps would be found in the section Higher Laws, where he's talking about consumption. And this consumption is something inhuman at times, because this gives rich material to eco-critics, definitely. When he recorded that no human being after his boyhood would murder any creature, wantonly murder any creature. The creature would hold its life, its tenure of life, as the person himself. The hare in its extremity cries like a child. I warn you, mothers, that my sympathies do not always make the usual philanthropic distinctions. He puts a lot of stress on the expression anthropic, referring to anthropos or human beings, and therefore philanthropy or thinking of other human beings working towards their welfare is not enough to Thoreau. Rather, he is talking about how anthropos and the so-called successes of the anthropos, the human being, are limited in nature. Complete absorption in this kind of an idea is never enough for Thoreau, at least. The third point that I would want to talk about is how Emerson was always trying to teach his disciples to be individuals, not to copy him, not to follow him to a great extent, uh, uh, with greater or lesser success, so to say. But in this context as well, in order to be an individual and in order to relate the self to the other, to the outer world, to the world around him, to be in nature, in his self and with his self, Thoreau actually tried to do a lot of things in terms of almost buying property once. And I'm talking specifically about how other people were trying to do a lot of improvement. The farmers were trying to improve their farms. I'm talking about the Hollowell farm, which we almost bought, uh, but not quite. So there, he found that the farmer was trying to improve the place and possibly would cut down those hollow apple trees, because to him they would be gnawed at by the hares and not viable possibly. But to him, going to these farms would mean an imaginative engagement with these places. It is almost as if for half a day, for a few hours, even for a few minutes, he enters into the spirit of the place. He actually makes it beautiful in his mind. If it is already beautiful, he enters into the spirit and he roams free over there with his mind. Now, in this context, he brings together, as in so many other places, he brings together the entire literature of the world, the entire philosophy of the world, so to say. And I mention this just in the context of that Hollowell farm, that one instance, he mentions De Re Rustica by the old Keto, and immediately afterwards he mentions the Indian text Harivansha. So in other places he talked about Confucius, about Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, about the independence, the liberation of the human spirit, the mind. I am reminded of something beginning with the Greek idea of know thyself, moving on to other places. I'm also thinking of the way he talked about the molting season for human beings. Just as, we must have something which gives us this opportunity to renew ourselves, selves, so to say, with reference to nature, with reference to the other. And in civil disobedience, I find that taken together, these two texts create a lot of resonances for me, especially right now, because in this COVID-19 pandemic situation, we are forcefully confined to our own places. There is social distancing, there is estrangement, and I would make a difference. Walden means that Thoreau was voluntarily sequestering himself, voluntarily living in a place of his own choice, etc. And in our case, it is enforced. So there is a difference. But if we enter into the spirit of civil disobedience, the 1848 lecture, what we find is that there, for one day, at least one night, one day, he was put into the prison for not paying his poll tax. And there he said clearly, he recorded clearly, I did not for a moment feel confined. So this was not voluntary. This was enforced. So he had experiences of both kinds, possibly, though the involuntary to a very little extent. But how did he move beyond these confines? There were physical confines always for people like him. How did he move beyond it? By being, by talking about extravagancy, I believe, extravagancy which permitted his mind his soul, his spirit, his imagination to move beyond all possible physical, mental, and spiritual boundaries. And I think that it is in this way, in civil disobedience, he imagines a state where which can afford to be just to all men and to treat the individual with respect as a neighbor, respecting the other, respecting others, so to say, as was being discussed earlier in the day. He says, I have imagined, but that state is not yet anywhere. Uh, Now, we can also feel that his aspirations, his refusal to be a consumer in the way other people were, the way he talks about the liberation of the human mind, the human spirit moving beyond all kinds of confines, would be very relevant. And that is why I try to revisit as often as possible, especially during this period of time. Uh, I'm trying to talk about, as a concluding comment, perhaps, that he is talking about certain kinds of confinement, as in the case of that beautiful egg which had existed in some living tree 60 years ago. And 60 years later, it blossomed, it came out as a strong, beautiful bug. So, the strong, beautiful bug or moth or butterfly that we all have inside our cocoons, inside our eggs, inside our cells, remain to be liberated. And I return to Thoreau, repeatedly revisiting him in order to accomplish this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and also thank you for, mentioning this idea of confinement, and which is something that I'm sure all of us who have read Thoreau, have been thinking of during these months in which we were, forced to be away from others, and trying to turn this into an advantage, or turn it around, and use this as an occasion, as you say, to get more in touch with something that it is buried inside, and often forgotten. I don't know whether I'm looking at Manju, whether we have time for a little bit of discussion at this
We
point.
can carry on for about 8 to 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, very good. So if there are any questions, or anybody who would like to comment on each other's presentation, that would be nice. You can just turn on your mic and speak up if you want. Or yes, Pavel. Go ahead, please. You've raised your hand. I can see you. You have to turn on your microphone. You have to turn on the mic because we can't hear you.
Am I unmuted right now, or is it?
No.
Can you hear me?
Now it's okay. Now we can hear you.
Okay. First and foremost, I'd like to thank all of you very much for those very insightful analyses, and takes on perhaps one of the most important authors of the last 400 years of American literature, but not just literature, but also thought. And it's kind of curious because when you take all of your approaches to the very concept of nature, you can actually tell that Thoreauvian thought, even though, as one of you argued, kind of looks towards the West, very much chimes in with very non-Western thought, and actually the very idea of what nature is. And I've always kind of thought that it goes way beyond the ecological thought, the ecosystemic thought, that actual nature is completely, totally transparent, because that's what reality is beyond words. And actually, what you have said seems to support this idea of mine. And I think, if you allow me to, and if your texts are published or will be published or will have been published within the next couple of years, I'll be more than delighted to actually be able to read some of your reflections and obviously cite them if I may. Thank you very, very much, and thank you, Georgia, for a very wonderful and very elegant chairing of that session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pavel. I don't know whether there's anyone who wants to comment on that or add something to that.
May I say something?
Tanya, yes, please.
Yeah, I would like to answer your comment, about Cape Cod. Yeah, you're deeply right, but honestly, it's been a long ago since I didn't return to Cape Cod, but it reminded me of Herman Melville's Moby Dick, and I think that there is, as far as I remember, because it's again a long time ago that I taught American literature. I think that Thoreau influenced Melville as well. There is an influence. So that's just my comment.
Yes, I am. Even though, as I said when we started, I have never really written on Thoreau. Even though I did write recently, I think last year, a review of a new translation of Cape Cod that was published in Italy, and that is why it's been on my mind lately. But I have written quite a bit on Melville, and reading that book, it was like really a shock, because I had only read selected passages, I have to confess, up to that point. But the way in which the sea is approached, the way in which the force of nature is described, the way in which the destructive, apocalyptic side of nature is approached is striking. And I to go back to something that Pavel said, I don't think that this is necessarily, something that is completely different from the Thoreau that we see in Walden, right? I mean, even though perhaps there we get a more sunny side of nature, and that destructive side is not, described in such stark terms as is in Cape Cod. But I guess that the two things can actually be seen as a kind of dialectic of nature. And that and both sides are ultimately, I think, assessed by Thoreau as being equally significant and equally important. But I really like what what you said about Melville and being so strikingly similar, because. I mean, I don't want to go on for too long, but when I was a student of American literature many years ago, in this country, initially, I was fed this notion that classic American literature basically was divided into two camps. There were the optimists like Thoreau and Emerson, and then there were the pessimists like Hawthorne and Melville. And and over the years, I've grown to realize that of course, there may be some small grain of truth in this, but actually, this is really sort of the wrong way to go about the whole thing, because there are so many connections between all these figures. And not to mention the fact that optimism and pessimism, can be useful categories only up to a point. But instead, I think that a writer like Thoreau really goes beyond these sort of simplistic categories, and I think that you've all shown how this is the case. If there is still 1 minute, there's one quick question that I wanted to ask Disha, if she doesn't mind. I really loved the way you set up, as I said, because I think it's a beautiful teaching tool, the idea of showing how the essay is kind of structured along binaries. I was wondering whether you see that as a kind of tension, or also in terms of evolution? Like when you say, for example, let's say the binary East and West, right? I mean, East is the past in a way, and West is the future. Is this something that we see as a movement, that we're sort of moving away from one thing, or is it some kind of tension that keeps sort of recurring, and therefore it's in a way a dialectical force that we can never sort of completely overcome? And this, of course, would probably apply also to many of the other binary that you set up in your presentation.
Yes, I feel that when he's using the binaries, or I I don't know, I think it stands out in the way he's trying to write the essay, and I do feel that it is more dialectical, because I think there is something to be gained from an oppositional framework, but the gain will sustain only as long as the to and fro movement, we can draw something out of it, because I feel that the binary is not just in terms of the East and the West, but it is also in terms of how Thoreau is imagining his own engagements internally and externally. And so this is the reason why when I read this idea about being more in nature, but at the same time coming back to a certain space. Also, by being outside, you could only revisit what is inside. So I see that even with the East and West, because he talks about when he's talking about literature and culture, and he says that we can read a lot of Shakespearean plays, but I think a few lines later he is saying that all that Shakespeare can give us is culture, and there's no literature that really talks about nature. Then sometimes he's talking about the East as a far bygone area, but then at the same time he's talking about certain Hindu imagery where a tortoise can balance an elephant, and an elephant can balance something, and he seems to be drawn. So I think what he's honestly doing is showing us the working of the human mind, and the fact that uh, before we turn gray, there has to be some black and white. I think to be able to then derive some learning out of it. So it's dialectical.
Yeah, may I chip in, Giorgio?
Thank you. Sure, of course.
Yeah, Pavel, I like the points that you raised. And in fact, the whole session was something that I was greatly interested in, because just last week I gave a lecture, an invited talk somewhere on the literature nature connect. And a lot of these ideas, I was dealing with a lot of these ideas in my talk. And in particular, I mentioned the sea stories that you mentioned, Moby Dick. And whenever I think of Moby Dick, I think of Powell, and I think of our Poland conference too. Yeah. So I did talk about Moby Dick, and yes, you can relate the sea stories with this spirit of nature that seems to pervade all animate and inanimate creatures. And yes, we are going to bring out, we are planning to bring out the presentations of this particular conference, and hopefully you shall have it very soon. Um, Maybe before we close, Giorgio, you might want to ask the presenters if they have any last thoughts on this session.
Sure. You're all welcome once again to say something on on each other's work, or something that maybe was left out of your presentations because of time. This is another chance you have. We still have a little bit of time. I can only say that as Pavel, I immensely enjoyed this workshop, and I'm really glad that I was given the the opportunity and the honor to chair it. Debrati, I think you want to say
Yes.
something? Yes,
Yes, I
please.
wanted to say something about the binary you have been mentioning, the East and the West, the past and the future, the spirit of returning to something in the East and moving forward towards the West in a spirit of adventure, etc. I was just reminded of this sentence from Walden, where in the economy section, he says, I've been anxious to improve the nick of time and notch it on my stick too, to stand on the meeting of the two eternities, the past and future, which is precisely the present moment. I thought that that could be a possible way of resolving this conundrum.
Yes, yes, yes. And Pravin, please.
Yes, I want to make a comment about the East and West binary. And you
Yes.
said that East is past and West is future. And I disagree with this kind of categorization, because the way the East is coming up in the present times and the West is declining, I would say, in certain sense. Because, for instance, if you look at the pandemic and the way the West has handled the pandemic, that's not very creditable. So to say that the East is past and it's nothing good to offer, that I don't think is the right kind of categorization. The East is coming up pretty fast.
Yes, I mean, I was by no means that I was sort of imagining that Thoreau might have said that, but it was certainly would not be my idea by any means. And but I think as both Disha and Debrati have shown, that's not the correct way to think about it. And the reason why I rose that I make the question is that when I teach that essay, one of the things that comes up in student discussions is, oh, but is Thoreau basically another manifest destiny guy? Isn't he like telling these young men to go west because he wants he doesn't like the eastern seaboard, he doesn't like the past, and isn't he participating in this kind of very imperialistic American ideology? And then that's where it is very useful to turn around, as you said, Praveen, this whole idea, and show that this isn't by any means what Thoreau is driving at, that there may be some passages in Walking where you can get that that impression, but actually if you read it carefully, that isn't what what the whole essay is about. And so thank you very much, because that is very very helpful in and you're absolutely right. I mean, here we have it, one of the many ways in which the West is fading is certainly in the way it has been handling this horrible crisis.
I'd just like to say that let us not replace one binary with another. So let's not, yeah, because I think then it just it becomes a cycle and
right. Very good. Well, once again, thank you very much. And I, as Pavel said, I also look forward very much to, reading your work, and and that way I will also have something to ask my students to read when I teach Thoreau, for those who want to, get a deeper understanding of the work of this amazing writer. And so, thank you very, very much. It's been a real pleasure and a real honor. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
And I hope to see you all soon in India next year.
Thank you so much, sir. So here we come to the end of another stimulating session for the day. And thank you so much, sir, for chairing the session. And I will just totally agree with Pavin, sir, when he said that how elegantly you have handled the session. Thank you so much, sir. And there is one point I want to make here is that in this session, how beautifully we have agreed to each other point of view is something remarkable. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, all the presenters. Your thoughts have been taken into consideration, and we are going to talk about it in the upcoming sessions also. And tomorrow, we are going to shift to non-fiction to fiction, and we are going to meet at 9:30 a.m. and request to all the panelists to be at the panel at 9:20 a.m. right? Thank you so much. Let's call it a day and see you tomorrow morning, 9:30 a.m. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.